The story begins with the narrator and their family staying at Uncle Ron's house during a fierce snowstorm. Their parents had gone out of town for a few days, leaving the kids in the care of their uncle, a jovial man with a tendency to tell spooky stories around the fireplace. The storm outside was relentless, and the wind howled like wolves in the night. To pass the time, the kids huddled together in the cozy living room, watching Titanic, with its famous tragic tale unfolding on the screen. But as the storm grew more intense, the lights flickered. First a few quick flashes, then the power cut out entirely, leaving them in eerie silence save for the sound of the storm battering against the house. For a moment they sat still in the dark, a chill creeping over them as the glow from the television screen flickered faintly in the background. Their uncle chuckled, muttering something about the storm being a perfect setting for a ghost story, but his voice was barely audible over the wind. It was the perfect mix of unsettling and mundane, and the kids, all of them on edge, stared at the darkened windows, feeling the weight of the storm's presence outside. When the power stayed out, they decided to bundle up in jackets and boots and head outside to see if the snow had covered up the footprints they had noticed earlier in the day. The air was sharp and cold, and the world outside was a vast, silent expanse of white, the snow reflecting the faint glow of the streetlight. As they stepped onto the porch, they noticed something strange. A trail of footprints leading from the back door of the house, meandering toward the woods behind Uncle Ron's property. The snow was pristine except for the prints, which seemed to go on forever, as if someone had walked out into the storm and never turned back. "Those weren't there earlier," their sister whispered nervously, her breath misting in the cold air. Despite their sister's warnings, who swore that they shouldn't venture too far into the storm, the narrator and their brothers exchanged determined glances. They couldn't resist the pull of curiosity, and one by one, they made the decision to follow the tracks. The snow was deep, and each step felt like a small adventure in itself, the air thick with the promise of mystery. They trudged through the snow, their breaths coming out in visible clouds, but as they ventured farther into the woods, the surroundings seemed eerily quiet, too quiet. The usual sounds of wildlife were absent, and the only noise was the crunch of their boots in the snow and the occasional distant groan of tree branches swaying in the wind. The footprints led them deeper into the woods until they stumbled upon something unexpected, a small, secluded cabin tucked between the trees. It was old, its windows dark and boarded up in places, yet there was an undeniable feeling that someone had been there recently. The door, although slightly ajar, creaked faintly in the wind, adding to the unease settling in their stomachs. The cabin seemed like something straight out of a nightmare, with an oppressive air that made their hairs stand on end. They didn't dare go inside, but instead crept closer to one of the windows, trying to peer through the grime and frost. The window was clouded with age, but through the gaps in the condensation, they could make out a dark figure inside, standing perfectly still in the dim light, motionless except for the occasional flicker of movement that made their hearts race. Suddenly they saw it. The dark figure's head briefly appeared in the window, a silhouette that was both human and not. It was like something from the depths of their childhood fears. Before they could react, the door to the cabin suddenly burst open with a loud bang, as though something, or someone, was forcing their way out. Panic surged through them. Without a word, they turned and ran back toward the house, the sound of their rapid footsteps in the snow mingling with the sounds of the storm around them. Their hearts hammered in their chests, and they didn't stop running until they were safely inside Uncle Ron's house, the door slamming behind them. They bolted the door, hearts still racing from the sudden terror of it all. But when the storm calmed and morning came, they tried to retrace their steps. The footprints had vanished, completely, as though the night's events had never happened. The cabin, it was nowhere to be found, not in the woods, not on any map. No one else remembered it, and the ground around it was untouched by any signs of disturbance. The strange events never left their minds, and the mystery of the cabin haunted them for years, each of them wondering if it was a shared dream, a collective hallucination born of fear and the storm's intensity. But in the deepest parts of their minds, they all knew what they had seen, and that, no matter how much they tried to forget, the woods held a secret they would never uncover. The second story takes place during a camping trip near Blue Mountain National Park, a place known for its pristine wilderness and breathtaking scenery. The narrator and two close friends, S and J, decided to spend a weekend exploring this area, famous for its hiking trails and peaceful remote lakes. They chose a camping spot near a small pond, far from the hustle and bustle of the outside world, hoping to enjoy the tranquility of nature and unwind. That evening, as the sun began to set, its soft light bathed the pond, creating a picturesque, serene scene. However, as night fell, the atmosphere became heavy and strange. When the three of them gathered around the campfire, chatting and laughing, an odd sound came from the pond, a light splashing sound, as if something was walking in the water, though there were no ripples or signs of any animal or person. At first, they thought it was just the sound of some wildlife, but the noise grew more distinct and eerie. It was an irregular sound, almost like someone walking through the water, pacing back and forth, but they couldn't see anyone. S and J exchanged worried glances. "It's definitely something in the water," S whispered, his eyes wide with unease. Despite their growing fear, they tried to stay calm. "It's probably just some animals," the narrator said, attempting to reassure them, though even they weren't convinced by their own words. Then, as they sat quietly around the fire, a sudden silence fell. The strange sounds from the pond stopped abruptly, leaving an unsettling stillness in the air. Suddenly, another sound pierced the silence, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Light, yet deliberate steps, moving close to their campsite. The sound of the steps grew nearer, as if someone was walking in the darkness. They froze, their hearts pounding. "Someone's coming closer," Jay said, his voice trembling. The narrator felt a cold shiver run down their spine. "It can't be." "We're the only ones here," they replied, but their voice lacked conviction. As they turned to look into the dark woods, a horrifying scream echoed through the trees, sharp and agonizing, as if someone was being attacked. The scream stretched out, seeming to come from deep within the woods, impossible to locate. The group's hearts raced in panic. "What was that?" S shouted, his face drained of color. "We need to go, now." Without another word, they hurriedly packed up their things, discarding anything that wasn't essential, and ran as fast as they could toward the car. Every step seemed to push them deeper into a state of panic. The cold of the night surrounded them, but their fear felt colder than any wind. They reached the car, locked themselves inside, and sat there, panting and trying to catch their breath. Outside, everything was silent, but the silence inside the car was thick with fear. "We can't stay here," Jay said, his voice nearly breaking. "Something's wrong." The narrator looked out the fogged-up window of the car but saw nothing. The woods were pitch dark, and all sounds of nature had vanished. Only the sound of their heavy breathing and the occasional rustling of the wind in the trees could be heard. As they drove away from the campsite, the footsteps and the terrifying scream lingered in their minds. The camping trip had turned into a nightmare, and from that night on, they never returned to Blue Mountain. The strange sounds from the pond, the unexplainable footsteps, and that blood-curdling scream would remain a haunting memory for them, no matter how many years passed. The next day, when they tried to make sense of everything that had happened, they couldn't find any trace of what they had experienced. No one else was camping in the area, and there were no signs of anyone nearby. What they went through could only be explained as a bizarre phenomenon, something they would never be able to rationalize. But one thing was certain: they would never forget that night when the sounds from the pond and the forest turned their fears into reality. The third story begins with the narrator, a passionate photographer known for his love of nature and its untamed beauty. On this particular day, he was out in the woods near the outskirts of a small town, aiming to capture the rawness of a storm rolling in. The rain began lightly, but it quickly turned into a torrential downpour, drenching the forest in a veil of mist. He loved the challenge of shooting in such conditions, believing it brought out the truest elements of nature: the wildness, the unpredictability, the power of the storm. The photographer had wandered deep into the woods, focusing on the lighting, the textures of the wet leaves, and the play of light through the clouds. When he realized he had ventured farther than intended, the rain had turned the trails into muddy paths, and the dense canopy overhead made it difficult to discern direction. He checked his compass, but the needle was spinning wildly, the storm playing tricks on his bearings. He glanced at his watch, noticing the time had passed much faster than he'd realized. The weather was worsening, and he was lost. As he tried to retrace his steps, he began to hear something. Footsteps. At first, he thought it was just the sounds of the forest settling after the rain, the trees creaking in the wind. But then the steps grew more distinct, more deliberate. Someone or something was following him. His heart rate quickened, and he felt a cold shiver creep down his spine. He turned to look over his shoulder, but the woods were silent again, as if mocking his fear. His breath became shallow, his fingers tightening around his camera, as if it could protect him from whatever was lurking in the shadows. But the footsteps didn't stop. They were still there, growing louder with every passing second, now unmistakably close. Panic set in. His mind raced. Was it a person? A hunter? Or something more sinister? Something from the dark corners of the woods? He pushed through the underbrush, trying to move faster, but the footsteps continued to match his pace, always a few steps behind. Suddenly, a tall figure emerged from the mist, partially obscured by the trees. At first, it was just a shadow, tall with a wide-brimmed hat, almost blending into the forest itself. The figure stood motionless like a ghost, watching him. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The narrator's breath caught in his throat. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It was as if it had been there all along, waiting. Instinct told him not to engage. He slowly turned his head, pretending not to notice the figure, hoping that by not acknowledging it, he could slip away unnoticed. But as he took a step, the figure moved as well, silently gliding between the trees, never breaking the distance. It was deliberate, calculated, and the way it moved made him feel like he was being hunted. The photographer's heart pounded in his chest. He broke into a full sprint, adrenaline surging through him, urging him to run faster. He stumbled through the mud, his boots sinking with every step, the camera in his hands now forgotten. The rain poured down harder, blurring his vision, and the world around him seemed to close in. Behind him, the figure kept pace, its footsteps growing nearer. He could almost feel its presence, a dark, oppressive weight on his back. His thoughts raced. Should he stop and confront the figure? Or would that be worse? Every time he turned a corner, ducked behind a tree, or tried to hide in the dense undergrowth, the figure would reappear, its tall form gliding through the trees, always just out of sight, but never far enough to feel safe. In a blind panic, the photographer pushed through the woods, the sound of his own footsteps and the heavy rain drowning out everything else. But then, just as he was beginning to feel completely overwhelmed, he caught a glimpse of something through the trees, the faint outline of a road in the distance. The sight of it brought a surge of hope. It wasn't far now. He could make it. With renewed determination, he ran toward the road, the figure now only a faint shadow behind him. His breath was ragged, his legs aching from the run, but he pushed on. When he finally reached the road, he didn't hesitate. He stuck out his thumb, hoping for a passing car. Moments later, a vehicle appeared, headlights cutting through the rain-soaked night. Without looking back, he climbed into the car, the door slamming shut behind him with a finality that felt like safety. As the car drove off, the photographer sat in the back seat, his mind racing, his body shaking from the exertion and the terror of the chase. The driver, an older man with a thick accent, asked if he was okay. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said, chuckling. The photographer didn't reply, his thoughts still trapped in the woods with the tall figure. The car sped away, but the encounter lingered in his mind. The figure, tall and silent, stalking him through the woods. It wasn't something he could easily forget. He had always been a skeptic, never one to believe in the supernatural. But that night, something about the figure's presence felt wrong, as though it belonged to a world that didn't fit with the one he knew. When he returned home, he tried to process what had happened. He checked his camera, hoping to find something, a clue, anything. But all the photos he had taken were blurry, distorted by the rain, the movement, and the panic. The last frame, just before he fled, was a blurry shadow. Nothing more. The figure had never been captured on film. In the days that followed, the photographer tried to push the experience out of his mind, but the memory of the tall figure, its relentless pursuit, and the feeling of being hunted lingered like a dark cloud. He would never return to those woods, and he could never shake the haunting sense that something, someone, was still watching, waiting for him to come back. The encounter would stay with him, a dark secret in the back of his mind, reminding him that some things are better left unexplored, some mysteries better left unsolved.